Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called Experimental Tests for Telephone Telepathy. Okay, and what the authors did in this paper is they took a group of volunteers and they made those volunteers give a list of 4 people that they're close to, so like friends or family. And the researchers conducting the experiment were given the phone numbers of those people, and the experimenters would reach out to those people at random and tell them to call the participant, the experimental subject. Okay, and then the participant was made to guess which of their 4 loved ones was calling them. Okay, and they guessed right way more than you'd expect by chance. Okay, so like it says here, by chance you'd expect them to guess right 1 out of every 4 times, or 25%. But in reality, they did this experiment like 571 times, and they found that people were guessing correctly closer to 40% of the time, which then they did statistical analysis. That's way above what you'd expect by chance. Okay? So what the authors conclude from this is that the minds of the participants who were guessing and the minds of their loved ones were in some way connected to each other, and that they were communicating telepathically. Okay, so obviously that's a very provocative claim, but that's why the paper is so important, because in mainstream science they tend to disregard anything that's considered paranormal or psychic, or that doesn't follow conventional rules of the physical universe. But there's actually a decent amount of research suggesting that there's more to the universe than the conventional physical principles that we are familiar with. Okay, so this paper, it has implications for concepts as far-reaching as spirituality, concepts regarding collective consciousness, and various other concepts that have been considered sort of like new age and have been disregarded by mainstream science, but it seems there's actually a decent amount of evidence supporting some of these things. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the method of this paper. We're going to, of course, go through the results, and then we're going to talk about how there's this type of experiment has been repeated by other researchers now like dozens of times, and how it seems to consistently show the same results. Okay, people are able to guess better than would be expected based on chance, and they correct for a number of other potential explanations for this. Okay, so as they say in their introduction, the rationale for why they did this study is because a lot of people report, like anecdotally, that they have, an intuition that somebody's about to call, and then they actually do call them, okay, or that they're thinking of a person just out of the blue, and then that person happens to call them soon after. Okay, but this has all been anecdotal, where people are just saying that they've experienced this. So these researchers wanted to test that. They said, is this a matter of chance? Is it a matter of coincidence, or is it something genuine? So they give a couple potential explanations for why people might be reporting this. So for example, maybe people only remember the times where that happens. So in other words, there's a lot of times where they think of somebody and then that somebody doesn't call, but they only remember the times whenever they do call. And so therefore there might be like a reporting bias due to like misremembering. Okay, but they want to test this experimentally. And so that's the goal of this paper. So like I said, what they did here is they took a bunch of volunteers. They had those volunteers give them, the researchers, a list of 4 people that they're close with who could help them participate in the study. And the researchers would tell one of those 4 people at random to call the participant. And then the participant was made to guess before figuring out who was calling. They were made to guess who was calling. And like I said before, they guessed right more than you'd expect based on chance. Okay, so for the methods, we said most of what we need to say. The way that they got these participants is through a newspaper ad section for part-time work. And then once they got their participants, they had them provide the 4 loved ones that they could help participate in the experiment with. Okay, each participant did 10 trials. There were a few who didn't complete all 10 because their 4 loved ones basically stopped participating. But regardless, the point is each participant engaged in multiple trials, some of them a lot of different trials. And then in combination, all the people participating total, they engaged in, as we said before, over 500 trials. So pretty high sample size for this experiment. Okay. It's worth saying that they also at one point modified this experiment. And what they did here is, in a second set of experiments, they asked the participants to provide 2 loved ones who could call. And then the researchers supplied the other 2. And these 2 people were strangers to the participants. So they were testing to see if you need an emotional connection in order to guess who's calling, or if it works for strangers too. Okay, they give a little bit more detail on the experiments. The way that the researchers chose which of the 4 loved ones to have call the participant is they used a die. Okay, so they would roll the die. They had assigned each of the loved ones a number 1 to 4, and they used that to decide which of them would call. Okay. When they got the call, the participant, they were instructed to immediately pick up the telephone and then say which person they thought was calling them. Okay? And that was then recorded, and the researchers looked to see if it matched who actually called and if that was better than would be expected based on chance. Okay. So again, they do a couple different variations with this, doing it at a random time of the day versus at fixed times of the day, and a few other specific variations. But for us, those details are not that relevant. Okay, so we're just going to go right to the results. Okay, so with table 1, this result is just a preliminary experiment run by one of the authors. So this author, Pam Smart, she basically did this experiment herself as like a preliminary test to see if it was even worth doing on a larger scale. Okay, and the way that this table is set up is on the right, these are the different people that could have been calling her, and they were randomly assigned. So like some of these are her sister, one of them is her mother, this is her friend, and then this is the other researcher. They were randomly made to call her, and then this is like how many times that person called her. And then in this column we're under right, that's how many times this author guessed correctly that that person was calling. And then this over here is the percent right. Okay, so for example, for when Angie called, her sister Angie, Pam guessed it right 25% of the time. Okay, when the other researcher, this Rupert, called, Pam guessed it right 67% of the time. And down here in the last row, that's showing the total. So out of 30 calls, Pam guessed it correctly who was calling 13 times, which is 43%. So again, that's much more than you would expect by chance. So with this preliminary experiment done, that's whenever they decided to add the volunteers and increase the sample size. Okay. And so then that's what is being shown down here. So they got all these different participants. So these are the 9 participants that completed at least 10 trials of it. Okay. And what you need to pay attention to here is basically how many trials they did. So this is how many phone calls they received and how many times they guessed correctly which person was calling them. So again, each of these people in these different columns, they had 4 loved ones, and one of those 4 randomly would be assigned to call them. This is how many phone calls they went through. This is how many times they guessed it right. So this first person, they guessed right 36% of the time. The second person guessed it right 50% of the time. Okay? And so if you look at this last column here, this is showing that across all of these 9 participants, there were a total of 146 phone calls, and they guessed correctly who was calling them 59 times, which is 40%. Again, you'd expect them to guess 25% if it was just based on chance. So it seems like there's something other than chance influencing their ability to guess who's calling them. And they did a statistical test and found an extremely small p-value. Okay, so if you're not familiar, a p-value, if it's a number less than 0.05, that basically just means you should accept the result as being genuine. And so this is much, much less than 0.05. So it's a very genuine result. Okay. Okay, with table 3, we don't really need to talk about it. That they just highlight one person's specific results as an example. And this participant, they did among the most trials out of anybody in the study. So they did this 30 times. They got it right 14 times, which is 47% of the time. All right. Okay, so this next table is interesting. So what they did here is, if you remember, I said there was one modification that they made to the experiment where they had participants provide 2 loved ones, and the researchers supplied 2 people that were basically strangers to the participant. Okay, and then they repeated the experiment. So one of those 4 people, either of the 2 loved ones or either of the 2 strangers, were randomly assigned to call the participant, and the participant had to guess which one was calling. Okay, so the way that you interpret this table is, again, each row is basically a different participant. So this EK, this person engaged in 36 phone call trials. They got it right who was guessing. Rather, they got it right who was calling 15 times out of 36. And then they split that up by whether or not the person was familiar with the caller or unfamiliar with the caller. Okay, so the F stands for familiar. And then the RT stands for right. So if the person calling was familiar to the participant, aka one of the loved ones, they got it right. This person got it right 10 times, and they got it wrong 10 times. So a 50-50 split, which is, again, that's way above what you'd expect based on chance. If the caller was unfamiliar to the person, they got it right only 5 times and wrong 11 times in this particular individual. So what really matters there is if we scroll down to the bottom, they have like the total section. So in total, with this second experiment, they had 232 phone calls, and it was guessed right 98 times, which is 42% of the time, which again, that's way higher than you'd expect by chance. And this is their p-value. Way less than 0.05, so very significant result. Okay. Now, if the caller was familiar to the participant, in other words, it's a loved one, they know each other, okay, then they guess it right 75 times, which is 54% of the time, which is way above what you'd expect by chance. Okay. Okay, interestingly, if you look at this column here, this is how many times they got it right when they were unfamiliar with the caller. Only 23 times, which is then 24% of the time, which is about exactly what you'd expect based on chance. So it seems that like the better you know the person calling you, the better you're able to guess accurately if it's them or not. Okay, so what they conclude from this is that you need to have an emotional bond to the person calling you in order to have this telepathic response. Okay, that's their interpretation of this. So they present that same information here, where really what you need to pay attention to is these first 2 bars. It's showing the percent correct guesses if the person calling you're familiar with versus if you're unfamiliar with them. Okay, this line here, this solid line, that's what you'd expect the bar to be at if the guessing is aligned with chance. So in other words, you'd expect them to guess it right 25% of the time, 1 in 4. And that's exactly what you see in cases where the caller is not familiar with the participant and vice versa. However, whenever they are familiar with each other, the guessing correctly is much higher than what you'd expect based on chance. And then these other 2 sets of bars, again, that's just 2 specific individuals that they're highlighting because of how many trials they did. Okay. This next table, they repeat the experiment with either like random times throughout the day. In other words, they would randomly tell the callers to call at a certain time or at specific times. Okay, doesn't really matter because it didn't really have an effect. They're still guessing right around 40% of the time. So not super important. This one's interesting, this next table. It almost suggests that there's improvement the more that people do this. So they compared like how much people got it right the first time they tried this, and it's 35%, versus the second time they tried this, where it jumps up to 43%. Okay, that wasn't a significant increase, statistically speaking, but it was close. So it almost seems like there might be an improvement that can be made if you practice this, okay? So if we're going to talk about telepathy, it almost seems like the telepathic abilities could be honed. It's like a skill that could be improved. Okay, next they repeated the experiment, except they were interested in determining if the distance between the callers mattered. And short answer is no, it doesn't. So they had various people in their sample. The people that they chose to call them were like living very far away. Okay, they were living overseas. And the researchers wanted to see if the loved one lives close. So the study was conducted in Britain. So if the loved one also lives in Britain versus if they live really far away, is there a difference in the ability to guess accurately when they call? And we can go down to this bottom column, and the answer is people got it right 65% of the time whenever the caller was from overseas. And they got it right 35% of the time when the caller was nearby from Britain. Okay, their explanation for this is that when they picked a loved one who was overseas, it tended to be someone they were very close with emotionally, like their mother or family member. Whereas when they picked somebody who was living nearby, it tended to be someone they weren't that emotionally close with, okay? Like a friend that's not as important as a family member to them. So again, it seems to suggest that emotional closeness is important for this telepathic connection. Okay, so that's mostly the paper. They had some other researcher also repeat this experiment to see if they could get it to work as well, to make sure it wasn't just these particular authors being biased or doing their experiment wrong. And in total, they found a very, very statistically significant effect where people are able to guess who's calling them better than you'd expect based on chance. Okay, and they eliminated most other possible variables. All right, so then the question is this just a one-off study, or is this something that's been observed multiple times? Okay, and the answer is it's been observed actually kind of a lot. So if we go to this other paper called Telecommunication, Telepathy, a meta-analysis, what they do is they basically take results from 15 papers that have looked at this and done 26 telecommunication telepathy experiments. And they look to see if you analyze all these papers simultaneously, do you see a significant result? And we're not going to go through the whole paper. We're going to skip right to their main finding, which is right here. Okay, so what this is showing is in each row, this is a different research paper that looked at this. Okay, and the way that you interpret this figure is if you look at the x-axis, the position left to right of these dots is basically how strong of an effect they find. So if the dot, the square, was at this dotted line, then what that means is that the participants in that study were guessing correctly exactly what you'd expect based on chance. So that would be like 25% in the previous study. Okay, the further the square is to the right of that dotted line, that means the more they're guessing correctly above chance. So in other words, like this study here, for example, they were guessing correctly in this study way higher than you'd expect based on chance. Only in one study did they guess lower than you'd expect based on chance. So what this is telling you is that all of these different studies were able to replicate this finding to various degrees. Okay, and then this diamond down here is basically showing if you try to pool all of the data. Okay, so there is indeed an effect, and it is significantly higher than you'd expect based on chance. Okay, so another interesting thing about this meta-analysis is that they attempted to figure out like what factors related to the strength of the prediction. So in other words, what factors about the participants led them to be better at predicting who was calling? And the biggest factor that they found is that the two had an emotional bond, a very strong emotional bond. In other words, if the caller and the guesser or two people who loved each other and had a very strong emotional bond, their ability to guess when they were calling was much, much higher. So it seems that a strong emotional bond is critical for understanding these effects. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to talk about with these two papers. So the question is, how is this working and what does it mean? Obviously, the authors speculate this is an example of telepathy, which is basically two minds communicating across a distance without speaking. That seems to be part of a broader pattern of research that suggests the existence of collective consciousness, which is basically there's a common information pool that people are feeding information into subconsciously and drawing information out of subconsciously. Okay, and so when I say that it's a pattern of research, there's other evidence for this, which we'll probably look at in future videos. But for example, there's evidence from reincarnation studies, which there's actually kind of a lot of those studies, where people claim to have lived past lives and give very specific details on their past life. And, one interpretation of this is that usually it's young children. One interpretation is that they're tapping into this collective consciousness and they're pulling information out that was put into this collective consciousness by a different mind in a previous life. Okay, there's also the phenomenon of xenoglossy. And what that means, that's where people basically start speaking a language that they shouldn't know and they shouldn't have had access to. Okay, so again, that can happen in reincarnation cases where these children, they start speaking a language that they shouldn't have been exposed to, and they claim that their former life spoke that language. Okay, so it could be that they're pulling information out of this collective consciousness. The same thing happens with some cases of alleged demon possession. Okay, people start speaking in another language that they shouldn't know. Okay, well, one interpretation is that for whatever reason, their brain is able to access this collective consciousness to a greater degree than other people, and they're pulling information out of this collective consciousness that they shouldn't have had. Okay, this is also potentially explaining why people can sense whenever a loved one is in trouble or in danger. Okay, their minds almost seem to be connected via this collective consciousness. Okay, so that has important implications for, like I said, like spirituality. It does seem to suggest that there's sort of a mind-body dualism where the mind is not just the brain, but rather it exists outside of the mind, and that has, of course, religious implications too. We'll talk maybe more about that in some future videos, but again, this is very implication-heavy finding, and it suggests that there might be a spiritual realm, and that's where the collective consciousness resides. Okay, so we'll talk about that more in future videos. Thank you for listening.